Can you talk about the role of academia in creating the professional managerial class? You have spent most of your life in university.
Yeah.
I, for better or worse, have spent my adult life mostly at universities. So I'm like, and also I'm particularly interested in the role of social sciences and like humanities in shaping discourse on social justice issues that are divorced from any type of economic redistributive politics and instead serve the purpose of manufacturing elite consensus that we are talking about. For example, what I spoke in my introduction about the concepts of intersectionality, white privilege, unconscious implicit bias as a prism to look at like social and economic issues.
I think you stated it really well. I think you painted a really great picture of it, but within social sciences and the humanities, there was an attempt, after 1968 to be relevant, right? To bring in the new left values into the institutions because the institutions were considered pro-Vietnam War, pro-American imperialism. Um, pro-capitalist, and so you have the takeover gradually of um, the social sciences and humanities by the new left, and the new left was very anti-working class. It wasn't always that way, but during the anti-Vietnam War protests, the college-educated anti-war protesters thought that all the uneducated people are pro-war, which was actually not true, but it was a perception with regard to the intensity of the college political activity versus ordinary Americans, and this kind of ordinary American sort of college elite circles started to become very, very alienated from each other. And within the social sciences and the humanities, there became a way that we reified the other in order to be its protector. And I think one of the most terrifying things about it for me, watching this as a leftist, is within the social sciences, there became a drive for statistical knowledge, data gathering, and policy formulated by this very, very empirically driven idea that if we gathered enough knowledge about inequality, then we could have the best policies about gov- government policies. And so much of that was depoliticizing. And I traced this out through the trauma book, that the social problems that precipitated the invention of social work, for instance, like urban poverty, child abuse, domestic abuse, sexual violence, all of those things became objects within governmental policy and academic circles as problems of awareness and prevention. And awareness and prevention are terms that are radically depoliticizing because it's the idea that if we're all aware of domestic violence, we'll reduce and prevent domestic violence. Within the elites, maybe that happens, but within economically stressed populations, domestic violence is linked towards economic dependency, usually of women and children on the male wage earner, right? And so if you really wanted to reduce domestic violence, everyone should be fighting for single payer health care because many women stay with men because their health care is attached to that wage earner job. And we have this kind of like incentive built in to the ways in which American insurance is not portable for people to stay in domestically abusive relationships. But you can also see that within working class families, when even the male wage earner doesn't have a good wage or health insurance, you have the dissolution of families and this kind of like serial monogamy on the part of the women that they practice. Jennifer Silva shows, and it's a mode of survival to hedge on dependency. And you have then, fragmented families, broken up families, because even that idea, and feminists started to admit this, that the male wage, the family wage was destroyed because of patriarchal powers, there's nothing to substitute it. Maybe it shouldn't be the state, but a single payer thing can't be, it's not necessarily a state organized thing. You just have an organization where there's no profit in healthcare and something is managed that way. It doesn't, none of the infrastructural changes that would make life better for all Americans rather than, slicing and dicing these identities, none of those are proposed. There's an awareness of special social issues that are designed to appeal to technocratic solutionism. And this happens in the social sciences. In the humanities, the relevance question, is not so like tied to quantifiable results, but is, I would characterize it as, the fetishization of a voluntaristic, um, um, expiation of white liberal guilt. So I decolonize the curriculum. Doesn't do shit for any colonized people, but I take out John Stuart Mill. I say we can't read Adam Smith. I'm going to read, I don't know, like, only women of color who were writing in the 18th century. There weren't any. So it's actually a demolition of history, of intellectual history, and the place of that making things relevant is actually in my will. Like, I will this to happen. That is not how historical practices actually produce concrete effects, like reading for race or sexual justice. Include, I'm really like mad at second wave feminism today. So rather than promoting um, working better conditions for working class women whose exposure to violence or pollutants or environmental ills is at a much higher level than college educated women, we say we're going to include women's voices in the curriculum. Like, that's what they want. Like, oh, all these, when I was coming up with the World War Science, there are all these women authors. Yeah, there are all these women authors. We patch up the thing, but what we're doing is curating our own sense of political virtue. And what we're actually not doing is encouraging the full participation of all people in engaging with intellectual curiosity, with a storehouse of cultural achievement that is everybody's legacy. Everybody should feel a part of the 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 traditions that have been handed down to us. Instead, we had people wanting to cancel Beethoven because the Ninth Symphony was very violent and even rapey. And that was a big part of musicology, like canceling Beethoven, Brahms, Bach, because somehow they're white Western European, elitists. What does that actually do for a single person in the world outside of the elites, outside of the PMC elites? Does it provide music education for someone in Africa? Does it provide music education for the kids in the favelas in Brazil? No, it does not. It does not. But it's a highly performative thing that I think happens because the jobs within the PMC are fewer and fewer, and you have to compete for more places, for fewer places, and you have to display your compliance with the reified social justice imperatives, and you have to perform your own virtue in such a way that your positions cannot be questioned. And so it's the killing of discussion and the killing of dissent. Just when women of color, people like you and me from other classes, are entering these professions, they turn to shit because everyone is terrified of actually talking to each other. And the things that you and I wanted from these worlds are stripped away from them. So I think it's really ironic that this has happened in this way, in the name of people like you and me. The greatest lessons I've learned from Marxism and the dialectic is all of these things are related dialectically. You can't separate Trump, the phenomenon of Trump, from the rise of a certain kind of liberal authoritarianism.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it would be one thing if these liberal authoritarians actually delivered benefits for the working class, but they don't. They only like want to preach at you. I call it fear and scolding. They want to transmit fear and scolding, like Obama did with African American male voters. Like, you better vote for him, don't be sexist. And it's like, you really think this is going to work? You really think um, young African American men are going to look at you, multimillionaire, like scolding them for being sexist? And these are putatively intelligent people. So you think like they're not dumb. So can't we make arguments? But in they're so embedded in this ideology that I don't see them being able to even come out of it and say, well, maybe this isn't working. I need to question myself a little bit. What happened after 2016 was that I do think that the liberals' confidence was shaken, and they were more interested in maybe leftist explanations of what had happened, right? And we were so close to the end of, well, not the end, but to 2008 to 2011, which was economically really devastating for the United States. So, what am I saying here? Yeah, so I'm saying I don't, I'm not very hopeful about the evolution of the Democratic Party, but I do think that there is a possibility, because I've seen in academia that young people are less entranced by identitarianism than ever before. And there was a wholesale adoption of it for a while. And I don't know why white people love to say, like, oh, it's the racism, it's the sexism. I just don't understand it, because that, but they love to do that because then they think that education is going to repair the polity, when education and its institutionalized and its particular institutionalization is part of the problem. And there's no, the way that education has been framed, the way that educational institutions have become these fortresses, these elite fortresses, very difficult to get into, very expensive, have created a real kind of separation from reality, let's put it that way. And there's actually within these fortress like institutions a kind of codification, I would say, of a cultishness with regard to identitarianism that I don't know how to undo. Like, I wish I had an exorcism wand. Like, just, what are you gonna spell? Like, I'm gonna free you from the spell. But more and more, well, just the fact that I have more of a platform with which to debate and talk about these things already better is already better than it was for leftist discourse before. That there's more variety in terms of how we can talk about identitarianism and economic organizations. So, um, what I tweeted out a couple of days ago was, the election was the negation of PMC values, right? And in that sense, I feel like those 71 million people who voted for Trump, they were not entirely deluded. And they're not necessarily for him, but they were against what the liberal Democrats represented, or the neoliberal Democrats, or I always call them pseudo liberal Democrats, because if they were true liberals, then they would be able to countenance a critique. But right now, if you criticize them like you're evil, that's not democratic culture. The adoption of criticism. That's how Trump acts. Like, oh, they're just in a conspiracy against me. That's how a demagogue acts. So
Yeah.
how can they receive the criticism? How can they engage in debates about identitarianism, and how it's a form of mind control is something we'll see as it plays out in the future. But I I
About, like, so your upcoming book about trauma and trauma culture, what prompted you to write about trauma? And can you help us trace the emergence of trauma in academia and popular culture?
okay, so the um the way that we talk about identitarianism doesn't really get to the root for
Hmm.
me of the problem until we look at the emergence of trauma within public discourse in the United States around the end of the Cold War, then accelerating into the 90s. That there was this idea that psychological affliction had no place in public life before the rise of a more therapeutic attitude with regard to media and public discussion. And I locate the emergence of trauma culture as a factor within the late Cold War when um, individual responsibility was the credo of the Reagan Thatcher years, and Oprah Winfrey comes onto her um, comes onto her television show, and before millions of people, confesses to having been sexually abused by a relative. This, I'm what I want to frame this as is it's not necessarily as revolutionary as we think, because it was being prepared for by the people who were advocating for the introduction of post-traumatic stress disorder into the diagnostic statistic manual that psychiatrists use to diagnose psychiatric disorders. And for feminists and for Vietnam veterans, the introduction of this category was supposed to allow women and Vietnam vets to receive better medical care, because there was a specific kind of traumatic disorder that was being ignored or overlooked. And the culture, I think, by the 70s and 80s, as America became more and more conservative and individualistic and more market oriented, the professionals, therapists, and psychiatrists really were infused by this idea that we could, through therapeutic methods, repair the dis- residue of horrific events that we had suffered either as children, as women, or as soldiers in the field. And the elevation of this discourse by Oprah Winfrey in popular culture was based upon a trauma script in which there would be a confession and then a very clear trajectory of recovery. And so Oprah's own trauma script was that her recovery was part of her success. And she laid the script down for other celebrities to be able to use their trauma, including Prince Harry, to promote a new brand of fame. And this was very in sync with the rise of self-help and recovery culture, and led to, and the arguments I make in the book are more detailed, but led to a um, promise within the commodification of the trauma script that there was a cure for PTSD. And in fact, what PTSD did in the DSM was create a great opening for psychopharmacology to produce drugs that would address the effects of the post-traumatic disorder as a chemical imbalance. And there are the revival of treatments in the United States, including electroshock therapy, hypnosis, things like that, that want to destroy traces of trauma. There was a whole different tradition of treating trauma that um, allegedly, like, psychoanalytically oriented people were into, but they sold out to the cure peddlers as well. And from a psychoanalytic or more Freudian point of view, we would say that human subjectivity is produced by trauma. Like, trauma is inherent, it's ontogenetic, and we each have to find our ways of dealing with it. They didn't, the insurance companies, the drug companies, they didn't like this because it seemed like it would be endless trauma, and so they had to create a disorder that could be treated by very targeted medicines. And they keep changing the medicines because they keep refining and innovating on that level. But the treatment of shell shock, which was the precursor to PTSD, in World War I and World War II, were created by innovative psychiatrists whose main goal was to cure soldiers as quickly of what we would say are natural fear reactions so that they can go back to the front. when it was transferred to feminism, second wave feminism, the focus on sexual violence allowed psychiatrists, feminist psychiatrists like Judith Herman, to focus on what I would say, what I call the hidden abode of seduction as the place of the greatest amount of abuse, moving it away from what Marx called the hidden abode of production, which is the factory and the workplace, the place of exploitation. And so we focus on, there's a kind of focus for second wave feminists on sexual violence, because also the whole thing about trauma is it's seen as a class, as a trans class problem. So everyone can be traumatized, any woman can be sexually abused, and I call it the gentrification of suffering. This is what I think is really important about the social problem orientation of trauma at the core of identity politics. Because identity politics also promotes this idea of vulnerability instead of power, individualism instead of solidarity, recognition instead of redistribution.
Mhm. We spoke about like Jennifer Silva's work and like how people are drawn to self-help, working class and PMC. Both of like these classes are drawn to self-help guides, and we have also seen trauma culture, like trauma stories, trauma-informed language, like being a dominant framework. How do you see this turn of self-help and trauma, particularly as an individualized avenue to understand one's predicament and in the and their place in the world, and what are the implications of this turn? I promise this is my last
No,
question.
this is fine. No, so I feel like this very scripted idea of trauma opens up human suffering to just greater forms of advertising and commodification. Because the great hope is that you can find the final cure. You can eliminate all the symptoms. You can't. But the culture of recovery, if we want to call it that, means that there's a trauma and we all have to recover within the working class embrace of self-help, which is about self-reliance and this fear of interdependency. Because as Silva showed, like in these working class communities, there's a collapse of economic help, so that anyone who has a little bit of success then is felt to be vulnerable to the needs of their relatives and family, and so they have to um, be constantly protecting themselves through self-help and motivation to you know keep whatever modicum of prosperity or economic security they've achieved. Um, for the PMC person, woman or man, a lot of the self-help narrative is about motivation to go back to a alienating workplace. And so a lot of that self-help is about self-optimization. And all of these cures, all of these seductive solutions to the pain of being human and the pain of being a worker, the pain of having been a victim, is presented as curable by reading another book, listening to another podcast, watching Oprah and Harry talk about their problems, um, taking a drug, going on a retreat, entering a cult. I mean, or asking for recognition. The other thing about the commodity is it never satisfies the individual need for recognition or healing. So it's just a constant aggravation of that need. And it's less and less about actually dealing with in real life human beings, but more and more dealing with social media and services.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's such an impediment to collective change, imagining any form of collective change.
And it's also, I think, a way of policing professionals. I mean, you're working in public health now, because now it's a new form of training that we all have to take, like the trauma-informed pedagogy or the trauma-informed technique that you work with in public health. It's another HR top-down thing that we are taught to um, do in terms of managing our own reactions to people, and in terms of managing any kind of situation that could be a liability for our employers, because people are in distress. but trauma-informed pedagogy does not help them, or
Yeah.
trauma-informed services.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for being so generous with your
Oh, no
time.
problem. Thank you for these. I loved your questions to begin with. So, thanks so much for
Yeah.
having me on. And